Hello, welcome back to Simon's Rants. I'm Simon, and today we're going to be talking about, should directors retire young? I bring up that question because Quentin Tarantino just recently turned 60 and he's working on his last film right now. He's claimed for a long time that he wanted to retire after turning 60 and after making 10 films, so this should be his last movie if he stays to his word. His reasoning behind wanting to stop at age 60 or after 10 movies is that he believes that directors stop being as good at that point because artists in general stop being as creative or as ingenuitive at a certain age. After you've exited your prime, you're not going to make as good art, so you might as well stop ahead of time.
I don't want to be a director that just directs because he doesn't know anything else to do. I'm working to diminishing capabilities, diminishing talent, diminishing focus. And frankly, I do feel a bad film on the filmography affects good films.
Which I think is a debatable premise to begin with, because even if artists aren't creating their best art ever, isn't the art that they're still creating worth viewing anyway? It seems like this idea is more wrapped up with trying to preserve a legacy rather than trying to create something new and great and wonderful for people to observe. Now, I do really respect Tarantino as a filmmaker, and I don't want to say anything to disrespect him here, but I don't really agree with the premise of this argument, and I don't even know if it's even true that artists get worse with age. I know that's the normal belief. People tend to believe that after they've exited their prime, their art isn't as good. I mean, people think about the Rolling Stones and how they keep pumping out albums every few years, and you're like, dude, just stop. Nobody wants to see that anymore. But is it actually true that musicians and directors specifically get worse after they turn 60? So I did some research. So the first director I looked up was Alfred Hitchcock. Not only because he's one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, but also because he directed into his old age, and that's what most people think of when they think of him, is him when he was old. Now obviously he wasn't old the whole time, so I wanted to figure out what was the average rating of his movies before he turned 60 versus the average rating of his movies after he turned 60. Now, much like when I did the greatest directors of all time list, I've got a couple of parameters here. I'm using the IMDb average rating, and I am also adding in the Metacritic average rating as well. If you don't know what Metacritic is, it's a lot like Rotten Tomatoes, but just better and more accurate. And also with Alfred Hitchcock in particular, I'm not including his silent film era into his movies because he wasn't a good silent film director, so I'm just considering the movies from after that. So this should help his pre-60 rating. But if you look at it, his pre-60 rating is an average of 73.9, and after he turned 60, his average rating is actually a 75.1. So they're pretty much identical, and it actually gets slightly higher after his 60th birthday. I think most people think of the movies that he made after he turned 60 as being not very good, but he actually began filming Psycho only a month after he turned 60, so he did still make some good movies after he turned 60. Also, The Birds has a very high rating. I don't think of it as that great of a movie, but people loved it when it came out. So yes, he did have some misses later on in his career, but he also had misses early on in his career. It just stayed pretty much the same before and after turning 60. But that's just one director, so let's look up some other filmmakers before we start creating ideas and assumptions about things. So next up, I looked up Charlie Chaplin, who, if you know anything about his career, he is kind of known for tanking at the end of his career. After hitting a certain age, his movies weren't nearly as good. And if you look at the divided rating, pre-60 had an average rating of 84.8 per movie, and after 60, he had an average rating of 67.8. So it seems that Tarantino's theory holds up when talking about Chaplin here. His movies definitely got worse after he turned 60. But I will also point out that he released Limelight when he was 62. And if you don't know what Limelight is, it's a fantastic movie. It's not his highest rated movie, but it's actually, I think, my favorite movie that he ever made. Now I know his other two movies, A Countess in Hong Kong and A King in New York, are not good. They're not great movies, and I don't think anybody would argue that they are. They're definitely Chaplin's two worst films, and he made those back to back right before he retired, so I think he got the idea he didn't really have it in him anymore. But still, Limelight is a fantastic movie, and he made that after 60, so What does that mean? From there, I moved on to another old director in Martin Scorsese, who, even though he's still active, he's been 60 since 2002, so has built up quite a track record since then. Enough to actually look and see he's once again got a higher average rating since then. His pre-60 average rating is a 75.9, and his average rating after turning 60 is a 78.8. Now, when you're thinking about recent Scorsese films, you probably think of his two most recent films, which are Silence and The Irishman, which aren't his best movies and aren't his worst movies. They're just kind of blah. So why is his rating so high then? Well, since turning 60, he also released Shutter Island, The Wolf of Wall Street, and The Departed, three of his best movies he all made after turning 60. So even though you could argue that Silence and The Irishman are near misses, because I don't even want to say that they're like bad movies, they're just not great movies either, they're fine, he has a great track record since that time. He's made some of his best movies recently. Like, I mean, The Departed is amazing, so is Shutter Island, so is The Wolf of Wall Street. He's made some really, really, really good movies in the past decade or so. So I think that there's a valid argument that could be made that Scorsese has actually gotten better since turning 60, which is the exact opposite of what Tarantino has said. Now, I know with Hitchcock, the average rating did go up by 1.2 or whatever, but that's not really that big of a jump, and it's mainly because I think Psycho was in there. It mainly just stayed the same, but with Scorsese, it definitively went up by 3 whole points. He got better. So far, Hitchcock stayed the same, Chaplin got worse, and Scorsese got better. I think we have to keep looking at other directors before we have a solution here. Next, I went to Steven Spielberg, who is another director that is currently active but has been over 60 for a while. Honestly, he's been a bit of a poster child for a while of a director that is past his prime. When you think of great Spielberg films, you think of his movies from the 90s mainly, and also back into the 80s, maybe a few in the early 2000s, but what are any of the great movies that he's made recently before The Fabelmans? The Fabelmans was a bit of a return to form for him, a lot of people considered, but really, what has he done in the last decade? Yet, when you look at his average rating, he has a 69.4 before turning 60, and he has a 73.2 since then. So why is that? Well, he has been pretty inconsistent since he turned 60 years old. I mean, he did release the BFG and Indiana Jones 4, but he also did make War Horse, which was a really good movie, and he made The Fabelmans, which was really good, and West Side Story has a very favorable rating, even though nobody saw that movie. So, inconsistent, but still pretty good. So what about before that? He was great before that, right? Well, he was actually pretty inconsistent before that, too. In between Close Encounters and Raiders of the Lost Ark, he released a movie called 1941 that had a Metacritic score of a whopping 34%. In between Indiana Jones 3 and Jurassic Park, he directed Always, which has a 50%, and Hook, which has a 52%. So even though we consider this his best era, he was actually still releasing mediocre to bad movies every once in a while anyway. So yeah, he's been releasing a lot of mediocre movies recently, but he kind of always did that. Now, he has some classics. He has a lot of amazing movies, but he also has a lot of inconsistent movies too, so I think we're just noticing the inconsistent ones now because they're right now. I will also point out, even though he has a higher average rating now, none of his movies since turning 60 crack his top 5 or even top 6 highest rated movies. All of his top 6 highest rated movies he made in the 90s and 80s. So what that means is that him at his best now isn't as good as it was before, but if the average rating is higher, that must mean that his worst isn't as bad as it was before. So I think this falls into the Hitchcock category again, where he didn't really get worse or better, he just kind of stayed the same after turning 60. So now we have one director that got worse, one director that got better, and 2 directors that essentially just stayed the same after turning 60. Let's look at another director. Stanley Kubrick is finally another example that I could find of a director that got worse after turning 60. But barely. Kubrick only released 3 films after turning 60, and one of them was Eyes Wide Shut. So that kind of just tanks the rating of post-60, when in reality the other 2 movies were Full Metal Jacket and The Shining, so he actually wasn't really bad after 60. If you look at the average rating before he turned 60, it was 81.2, which is ridiculously high. Now, it did drop all the way to 75.2 after turning 60, but keep in mind 75.2 is better than Spielberg's entire career. So yes, he got worse, but he was still pretty darn great. So when you look at The Shining, Full Metal Jacket, and Eyes Wide Shut, you end up getting an average rating rating that is worse than his previous film's average rating, but it's really just the one movie that was a misstep. And it's not even like it's his worst rated movie either. Eyes Wide Shut is actually his second lowest rated film. He had one film called Killer's Kiss that was a lower rated film early on in his career. So if you look at his whole career, he has two movies that are considered bad to mediocre. And you take each one of those films and add it to the pre-60 and post-60. And unfortunately for the post-60 pool, there's only 3 movies there, so the one negatively rated movie is going to drag down the rest of them. Now granted, Full Metal Jacket and The Shining aren't in the top 5 of his highest rated movies either, so overall the rating is going to be lower, but it's also just a smaller sample size. And I also just think, as great as he was after turning 60, I don't think you can use him as an argument for why you should stop making movies after turning 60. Did he get worse? Yes. Was he bad? No. He just made one bad movie, but he had also made another bad movie early on in his career, so it's not that big of a deal. So based on this limited research I did, which granted it's not a huge sample size, it's just a few directors, we learned that some directors got better, some directors got worse, but for the most part, they just stayed the same after turning 60. So it really just goes to show that the metric is pointless. It's meaningless. It doesn't have any basis to it. Now I know, like I said, Chaplin did get worse after turning 60 for whatever reason. I don't know why, but he did make Limelight, and Hitchcock made Psycho, and Kubrick made The Shining. Now maybe they made a lot of forgettable or bad things in between. A lot of artists do. Isn't making forgettable or bad art worth it if you're going to come up with something like Limelight? Isn't now A Countess from Hong Kong and A King from New York all worth it because we got Limelight? Isn't The Birds and Frenzy and every other mediocre movie Hitchcock made worth it because he kept making movies and made Psycho? I just get so frustrated when people talk about artists and musicians and directors like their legacy is more important than just making new, good, entertaining stuff. Like Eminem, I get it, his first 3 albums, so much better than anything he has ever made and ever will make at this rate, but still, I like Recovery a lot. It's a really good album. Also, Rap God is a great track, and I like Kamikaze as an album too. Is it like old Eminem? Is it as good as old Eminem? Definitely not, but it's still worth being made, because art isn't about preserving a legacy. It's about creating art, not for critics, not for fans, not for other artists to perceive and think about. It's about making art for yourself. If other people enjoy it, great, but it's about just creating art for the sake of creating art. That's why every artist creates, at least I would hope so. And yeah, maybe your art won't be as good as when you first started, or maybe it will get better in time, like Scorsese. Who knows? That's not the point. The point is to just create. And honestly, it doesn't seem like we've got definitive proof that artists actually get worse with age, at least directors. And it's not just directors either. I think that this applies to artists of all kind. Paul McCartney released the album Egypt Station when he was 76 years old, and to me, it's his best album. I'm not trying to say that it's better than Abbey Road or the White Album or anything like that. I don't believe that. But as far as his solo work goes, it's as good as it gets to me. Now, I know that's just my opinion. I don't think the average person would agree with me on that, but it is definitively a good album. I don't think anybody would argue with that. But I mean, that's a whole nother video. That's not what I'm talking about. Really, I'm talking about directors. So, Tarantino, love you, man. I just disagree. And I guess at this point it's too late for you to not retire, because then you would just be a man against your word. But you could keep making movies. Maybe your legacy will get lowered because of it, but who cares? When people talk about Chaplin, do you think anybody's talking about A Countess from Hong Kong or A King from New York? No. No, they're not. Nobody cares. When you talk about Hitchcock, do you think about the last couple of movies he made that weren't as good? No, you think about the great movies. So, just keep making stuff until you don't want it anymore. Every artist has a certain amount of fuel in the tank, and you just have to play it out, see wherever it takes you. Some people will keep being able to make music or movies or whatever until the day they die, and others should retire young because they're done saying whatever they need to say. Billy Joel said it himself when asked, why don't you make albums anymore? And he was like, because I'm done.
I thought I'd had my say.
Really?
Yeah, I just said, okay, shut up now. But if I have an idea for a song, I'm not going to stop myself. I just haven't had the desire to do it.
And I think that's true for a lot of creators. After a certain age, they're done. But obviously not everybody. So Just say whatever you feel needs to be said and keep making art as long as you want. Don't worry about age. Don't worry about legacy. Just do you. I'm Simon from Simon's Rants, and that was my rant for today. Thanks, guys. Bye.